The first thing you would notice is the smell, long before you ever understood the name of the god behind it. Not rot exactly, not the sharp violence of decay, but something heavier and strangely patient, like damp earth that has learned how to breathe. It settles in the lungs and refuses to leave. In the Imperium, death is often loud and sudden, delivered by bolt shells or orbital fire. But this is different. This death waits. It hums softly. It promises that nothing truly ends, that even pain can be held forever. Long before scholars etched the name Nurgle into forbidden data slates, long before plague cults whispered prayers through cracked lips, this presence was already moving through the warp, vast and unhurried, smiling with a warmth that feels almost kind. This is not the story of a monster that wants to destroy the galaxy. This is the story of a god who wants to keep it, exactly as it is, broken and breathing, forever. If you find yourself drawn into this slow, suffocating tale, consider lending your support by liking the video, sharing it with others who walk the darker paths of Warhammer lore, and subscribing to the channel. It helps these stories endure, carried onward like spores on a stagnant wind. Before humanity ever looked to the stars, before the first civilizations traced their marks across distant suns, there was already a sickness in the warp, a subtle, persistent pulse that moved like a slow tide through the immaterium, shaping thought, emotion, and the faintest whisper of sentient fear. Nurgle's essence, though not yet named, was already present, formed from the quiet accumulations of despair, resignation, and the inevitability of decay that hovered wherever life struggled to endure. The early warp currents, uncharted and chaotic, stirred with the emotions of nascent species, collecting the fear of mortality, the dread of failure, and the whispered acceptance that suffering is an inseparable part of existence, and from these threads, a consciousness emerged that would become the Plague God. Unlike his siblings in Chaos, whose desires are loud, flamboyant, and violent, Nurgle does not rage. He waits. He observes. He cultivates, finding sustenance not in destruction but in the patient, meticulous unfolding of entropy over time, teaching the universe through subtle persistence rather than sudden devastation. In those first eons, the early warp beings recoiled from him, not because he sought their harm, but because his attention was alien. He acknowledged life not to consume it in hunger or ambition, but to hold it, to sustain it in imperfection, in sickness, in slow transformation. The first mortals who glimpsed this presence did not understand it as a god, for no mind could yet conceptualize patience so vast, so intertwined with decay, yet some sensed a warmth that was nearly comforting, like the faint pulse of a heartbeat beneath a corpse, an impossible life insisting upon itself. Plagues that later bore his unmistakable signature began as subtle stirrings in the warp, bending the fragility of flesh to his philosophy. Organisms survived, mutated, or endured not by triumph, but by adaptation, by the acceptance of inevitability, by the learning that to live is to decay, and to decay is to persist. Across isolated star systems, these first manifestations were recorded in the fevered scribblings of proto-scholars, in the oral traditions of early human and alien civilizations, in the whispered prayers of those who faced inexplicable illness and survived only to carry its lessons to the next generation. Entire ecosystems were unknowingly shaped by this quiet rot. Fungal blooms that consumed dead matter yet nourished the living, waterborne pathogens that rewrote the evolution of aquatic species, and spores that lingered, patient and waiting, until a suitable host arrived to carry them onward. Early humans, confined to fragile worlds, came to understand disease as an unrelenting companion, sometimes fatal, sometimes transformative, yet always shaping the arc of existence in ways that could not be resisted, only endured. In this way, Nurgle's influence was never merely biological, it was philosophical, threading its lessons into the psyche of the living, instilling a subconscious reverence for survival at any cost, for perseverance beyond understanding, and for the acceptance that suffering is an inherent and instructive part of life. The warp itself became a mirror of this principle, a realm where time flowed differently, where emotions coalesced into patterns, where despair and quiet hope intertwined until they became indistinguishable, forming the primordial lattice upon which Nurgle would later build his dominion. Even the first demonic entities that emerged sensed the difference. Some were repelled by the slow, deliberate nature of his attention, others were drawn to it, learning that patience and persistence could be as potent as fire and fury in shaping the fate of mortals. Mortals and immortals alike, who later encountered Nurgle's presence, would glimpse echoes of this ancient origin. The patient decomposition of a world, the gradual corruption of a regiment, the enduring life of a plague-infested organism, all teaching the same lesson that the first warp currents had whispered to the cosmos. Life is fragile, suffering is inevitable, and endurance is the ultimate form of power. Even before the first plagues swept through human or alien worlds, before the first cults whispered his name in fear or reverence, Nurgle's philosophy was already encoded in the rhythms of existence, slow, inescapable, and ever-present. The Imperium, in its arrogance, believes that such things can be purged, eradicated, or contained, yet the first rot in the Immaterium reminds the galaxy that entropy cannot be hurried, that decay is not a failure but a state of being, and that the patient god of disease has existed for longer than memory, waiting not to conquer but to tend, to teach, and to endure alongside the life he touches. In the silence between stars, in the shadows of worlds yet unborn, Nurgle's hand moved, unseen but undeniable, planting the seeds of the gardens that would one day spread across the galaxy, ensuring that when humanity finally rose into the stars, it would do so under the careful gaze of a god who teaches that the greatest gift is not triumph, but survival. And the greatest truth is that nothing ever truly ends, not even in the embrace of decay. Long before humanity's rise to dominance, before the great star empires charted the void or terraformed planets into gleaming hive cities, Nurgle's touch had already begun to whisper across the galaxy, carried not by the roar of war but by something slower, subtler, and infinitely more insidious. Disease was the first language of the god, a quiet pedagogue teaching civilizations the paradoxical lesson that survival and suffering are inseparable. Among forgotten Xenos empires, entire worlds were reshaped by pestilence. Spore-laden winds swept through crystalline metropolises, alien scholars cataloged their failure to stop the spread, and priests of unknown faiths offered sacrifices in vain, mistaking endurance for deliverance. On nascent human worlds, the first scattered colonies faced similar quiet devastation. Populations confined within rudimentary habdomes discovered that illness could arrive without warning, that a single cough could transform the social fabric, that life itself could persist in grotesque adaptation even as the body betrayed its owner. Families learned to live with swollen, feverish children whose minds flickered with both clarity and delirium, finding in their care a perverse intimacy. A lesson that to endure is to accept the slow erosion of what was once comfortable and known. Across the stars, contagion became ritualized in countless ways. In some worlds, priests offered prayers to invisible forces that were not quite gods. In others, the sick were tended with reverence as conduits of a truth no mortal scholar could grasp. The narrative of plague was never simple. It was both curse and blessing, a vector of horror and a path to understanding that life cannot be untangled from decay. The plague. God's influence was not always immediate or violent. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a single, inexplicable malady that persisted, resisted all remedies, and shaped generations, a lesson etched into memory, whispered to children who would grow to see disease as companion as much as enemy. Mortals began to interpret the patterns instinctively, learning that avoidance is temporary, that desperation is fleeting, and that endurance, painful, humiliating, and relentless, was the only true constant. In this era, the concept of cults was nascent, fragments of devotion forming around the recognition that suffering could be acknowledged without panic, that decay could be honored without submission, and that to tend one another, to care for the sick and infected, was itself a ritual blessed by forces unseen. Nurgle's methodology was both philosophical and practical. Where one world burned a city to contain an outbreak, another nurtured it in secret, observing the slow transformation of flesh and spirit, noting how societies adapted, how hierarchies shifted, and how even death could be managed into something enduring. Mortals who survived these plagues, by cunning, by chance, or by grim devotion, emerged with a fractured understanding of life, attuned to rhythms of illness and recovery, capable of navigating the void not with swords or fleets alone, but with patience and pragmatism that reflected the very ethos of the plague god. Every planet that succumbed to plague was a laboratory for existence, a crucible where resilience was measured not by the number of the living, but by the continuity of memory, culture, and stubborn persistence in the face of entropy. Xenos observers occasionally recorded these phenomena, noting that human colonies seemed peculiarly adept at surviving conditions that would annihilate other species, that they bore both disease and endurance with equal measure, and that those who ministered to the afflicted often emerged as strangely serene figures, carrying with them a sense of purpose, untainted by hope or despair. By the time the Great Crusade began, these lessons had been woven into human experience, subtly guiding the Imperium's approach to survival and conquest, often unconsciously, as a shadow beneath the grand strategies of fleets and armies. Even in worlds cleansed by fire and scorched to glass, traces of this ancient pedagogy lingered, shaping the rebuilding, influencing the architects of habdomes and the planners of manufactorums, ensuring that every new generation was in some way conversant with the patient, unyielding philosophy of life's persistence amid decay. And yet, for all its subtlety, the touch of Nurgle was also unmistakable in its horror. Children who recovered carried lingering mutations. Adults bore scars in flesh and spirit, and entire societies were reshaped into microcosms of the garden itself, where infection was neither wholly banished nor fully embraced, but tolerated as part of a rhythm older than memory. Mortals across these ancient worlds would never speak of the god by name, and some would not believe in his existence at all. Yet they carried his influence in their rituals, their medicinal practices, their songs for the dead and dying, and their quiet acceptance that suffering was inseparable from survival. Even the first scattered psychers recorded dreams of verdant rot and sentient spores, visions that scholars dismissed as fevered delirium, yet which resonated with a truth beyond mortal comprehension, that decay is a teacher, that the slow spread of disease is a language, and that Nurgle had already begun his patient work across the stars, laying the foundation for the inevitability that would shape humanity's long struggle with chaos, war, and survival. Plagues were no longer mere events. They became the architecture of life, invisible but present, shaping minds, bodies, and societies alike, until the very idea of immunity was less a promise than a fleeting reprieve. And in every hushed whisper of the cosmos, every hidden ritual, every sickbed tended with grim devotion, the shadow of Nurgle's philosophy grew, imperceptible yet undeniable, preparing the galaxy for the larger, more deliberate interventions to come, ensuring that when humanity finally clashed with chaos on a galactic scale, the plague god's lessons in endurance, adaptation, and the subtle power of decay would already be woven into the marrow of every world, every soldier, every mortal mind, capable of perceiving that suffering is both curse and covenant, horror and blessing. The silent teacher behind every survival story across the stars. By the time humanity had stitched together the earliest stars into a fragile imperium, Nurgle's influence was no longer confined to whispers in the warp or the fevered imaginings of distant cultists. It had become a slow, unyielding force, pressing against the very bones of human civilization, threading itself through the endless litany of war and survival. Worlds teetered between life and death, and the plague god's presence was often felt most acutely not in spectacular conflagrations, but in the quiet moments that preceded them. A regiment of the Astra Militarum marching through mud-choked trenches, coughing up blood from lungs lined with the unseen touch of decay. A hive city where children learned to weave masks from rags, not against orcs or raiders, but against the invisible, patient rot that crept beneath the streets. And among the higher echelons of imperial power, whisperings of pestilence that no purging could undo. Rumors that some regiments would return from the front not victorious but transformed, their bodies swollen with blessing or curse, their eyes bright with unspoken understanding. In this period, the narrative of the Imperium collided with the philosophy of Nurgle. Endurance above all else, suffering as both proof and reward, the willingness to persevere even as flesh and mind betrayed one another. The Death Guard, loyal first to the Emperor and then seduced by promises that spoke not of conquest but of survival, became the living embodiment of this principle. Their warriors moving through campaigns with an eerie calm, embracing corruption as a tool, a philosophy, a pathway to exist beyond the limitations of pain. As the Horus heresy unfolded, these truths became clearer. The galaxy did not resist Nurgle out of hatred or moral rigor, but because fear, hope, and duty collided in an uneasy balance, creating the perfect conditions for a god who thrives not on chaos alone, but on the patient and inevitable decay of all things, including the brightest glories of the Emperor's empire. Mortals who encountered Nurgle's gifts directly often did not perceive malevolence in the traditional sense. A sergeant in a trench line might find his men transformed into grotesque parodies of life, yet there would be no pain, only a strange, lingering vitality, a sense that life continued in a way he could neither control nor fully comprehend. The Imperium's codices and reports describe these phenomena in clinical terms, counting casualties, recording infections, and issuing directives to quarantine and purge. But in the hearts of those who witnessed the creeping rot, the reality was far more insidious and subtle. Nurgle's influence was not about victory nor about loss, but about the quiet accumulation of inevitability, a philosophical rot that spread silently even amid the loudest guns. And yet, amid the despair, there were moments of dark poetry. A plague-bearer leaning over a dying commander, whispering encouragement that the officer could not understand, yet which soothed his mind as his body betrayed him. Nurglings crawling across a battlefield littered with broken bodies, sowing laughter as though each life taken were a seed for something beyond comprehension. And the ever-present, invisible hand of Nurgle guiding, tending, and watching, indifferent to the cries of those who believed themselves alone. The chapter of humanity's long war with itself and with chaos became inseparable from the plague god's patient designs. Every skirmish, every attritional campaign, every failing supply line fed into the rhythm of decay that he orchestrated, teaching mortals that to endure, to continue despite everything, is a form of grace. Even within the Imperium, those who observed these patterns sometimes dared to whisper that Nurgle was not merely a god of disease, but a reflection of the universe's own insistence on continuity, that suffering is the substrate of survival, and that the finest acts of heroism, the holding of a trench, the defense of a hive, the raising of a banner amid hopeless odds, were themselves shaped by the invisible tutor of pestilence. The Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning conflict that should have destroyed humanity utterly, instead became a canvas upon which Nurgle painted subtle lessons. Worlds fell, fleets burned. And yet from every catastrophe, a fraction survived, tainted and transformed, bearing in their veins the unspoken blessing of endurance. Plague Marines, once human, now walking shrines to their god, were not simply instruments of destruction, but philosophical statements in flesh, showing that the body may fail, the flesh may rot, yet the spirit, or that which survives the mind, can persist, reshaped but unbroken. Within every afflicted world, every quarantined sector, every campaign lost or won at great cost, Nurgle's quiet hand guided events toward a slow, inevitable equilibrium, where death was not the conclusion, but a transformation, and suffering not punishment, but a lesson in continuity. It was a galaxy where victory mattered less than survival, and survival always carried the signature of the plague god's intent, subtle, unrelenting, and oddly tender. As mortals prayed to the Emperor, to saints, and to their own desperate courage, they unknowingly mirrored Nurgle's philosophy in miniature, enduring beyond sense, continuing despite injury, embracing what cannot be changed, and finding strange solace in the persistence of life itself. The chapter closes not with the fall of a hero or the triumph of a foe, but with the quiet acknowledgement that once Nurgle touches a person, a regiment, or an entire planet, nothing will ever be the same, and that the long war of humanity, for all its glory and horror, is also a garden of endurance tended by a god whose patience is eternal, whose philosophy is survival, and whose dominion is already written into the rhythms of suffering and persistence that govern the lives of all who dwell beneath the stars. Beyond the physical boundaries of the galaxy, past the tangle of warp storms and the drifting husks of dead starships, there lies a place that few mortals truly glimpse, and even fewer live to describe. A garden where decay is not feared, but cultivated, where every sickly bloom, every crawling fungus, every bloated fruit serves as both nourishment and monument to the patient will of a single god. It is said that the Garden of Nurgle stretches farther than the mind can follow, a labyrinth of verdant rot, vast and unhurried, where time bends and loses meaning, and where the air is thick with spores that carry whispers of comfort as much as pestilence. Demons speak of it in hushed, reverent tones, describing how the plagues that sweep through the stars are but extensions of the garden itself, pollen and seed carried outward to prepare new soil for the slow work of transformation. And though the Imperium knows nothing of such a place in any verified record, rumor, liturgy, and the fevered testimony of heretical psychers hint at its existence. Within this strange realm, suffering is neither cruel nor accidental. It is a pattern, a discipline, a form of care. Mortals and immortals alike who find themselves within the garden perceive it differently. Some see it as paradise, others as a nightmare. But all sense the same truth. Here, nothing is wasted, nothing truly perishes, and everything is attended to with an almost obsessive patience. The plants themselves writhe and twitch, their tendrils curling around corpses not to consume them, but to cradle them, digest them slowly and return their essence to the soil, while enormous flies with translucent veined wings buzz lazily overhead, carrying spores that do not merely infect, but integrate, reshaping flesh and mind into new forms. Here, Nurgle himself is rarely seen, though his presence is undeniable, felt in every inhaled particle and every tremor of the ground, a gentle, persistent pressure that implies attention, awareness, and approval. Saints who have glimpsed this garden in visions describe a deity unlike the other chaos gods, not one of wrath, of fire, or of cunning, but of patience, of guardianship, tending his creations with devotion that mortals might mistake for affection. And yet the affection is alien, entwined with entropy in ways the human mind cannot fully comprehend. Pilgrims speak of wandering through corridors of fungus taller than a cathedral spire, of inhaling spores that bring vivid dreams of loved ones long dead, of touching leaves that pulse like arteries, and of sensing eyes upon them, eyes that do not judge, but simply acknowledge existence and allow it to continue forever. Within the garden, time is subjective. A single night may stretch into centuries. A single cough may last lifetimes, and yet nothing is hurried, nothing forced. All decay unfolds naturally, lovingly, as though the universe itself had been placed into a cradle and allowed to breathe. Mortals who are brought here sometimes emerge changed, carrying with them not only the marks of disease, but also a strange serenity, a sense that suffering and survival are not opposed, but intertwined, that the limits of flesh are less frightening when viewed as part of a cycle rather than a termination. Scholars who attempt to piece together the metaphysics of Nurgle's domain struggle with language, for words of horror cannot convey comfort, and words of love cannot capture entropy, yet both exist simultaneously in every corner of the garden. Some texts, hidden in the vaults of the Ordo Malleus, record testimonies of inquisitors who felt the weight of eternity pressing against their minds, hearing not screams but sighs, tasting not bile but a sweetness that seemed to emanate from rot itself, and though they claimed to purge the visions with ritual, the memory lingered, shaping their understanding of the galaxy's fragility. Beyond these mortal perceptions, the demonic hierarchy reflects the same philosophy. Nurglings flit and crawl, their laughter neither cruel nor mocking, but playful and nurturing, spreading diseases that are as much gifts as curses, while plague-bearers march through endless rows of rotting groves, tending and guiding the manifestations of their master's will, performing rituals whose meaning is both precise and ineffable. Mortals who attempt to interpret these acts often mistake them for mindless cruelty, but the truth is subtler. The garden, and Nurgle within it, embodies a principle of care through transformation, a slow and immutable patience that accepts the inevitability of death, yet refuses to abandon what has been created. In whispered corners of the Imperium, among those brave or foolish enough to consider heresy without accusation, there are those who speculate that every plague world, every outbreak, every corrupted biome owes its origin not solely to malice, but to the reach of the garden itself, a patient hand tracing life and death like a gardener pruning a garden of impossibly complex flora. And yet even as Nurgle cultivates and tends, the galaxy outside continues its endless cycle of war, conquest, and desperation, and the garden of Nurgle waits not with impatience or anger, but with certainty, a vast, eternal repository of existence in all its fragile, decaying glory. Those who enter may never leave, and those who leave carry with them seeds of that patience, a reminder that the God who governs decay is neither chaotic nor vengeful in the manner of others, but meticulous, ever watchful and unhurried, tending his creation with a devotion that mortals can never truly understand, but can only perceive in fragments, in the sudden acceptance of what cannot be changed, in the quiet sigh that follows suffering, in the knowledge that even as empires fall and stars burn out, the garden endures, eternal, growing, and infinitely patient. In the closing years of the 41st millennium and the opening wounds of the 42nd, Nurgle does not surge forward like a conquering tide, because he no longer needs to and perhaps never did, for the galaxy has learned his lessons too well, breathing them in with every recycled lungful of air and every prayer murmured through cracked lips. The Imperium names this age one of rebirth, of crusade and indomitable will, yet everywhere the signs of quiet surrender persist. Worlds reclaimed only to be quarantined again within a generation, Astra Militarum regiments rotated endlessly through war zones where victory means survival for another month. and hive cities sealed level by level as infection creeps upward like ivy through stone. In these places, Nurgle's presence is not always marked by bloated corpses or weeping sores, but by something subtler and more enduring, a collective exhaustion that settles into the soul and whispers that resistance is admirable, but rest is kinder. Ecclesiarchy sermons thunder about purity and endurance beneath the imperial Aquila. Yet in the crowds there are always those who flinch at the word endure, because endurance is a long road, and Nurgle offers a shorter one, paved with acceptance rather than hope. Among the Death Guard, now fully given to their patron, this truth has become a creed rather than a temptation, and they march through fire and shell with a calm that unsettles even other servants of chaos, not because they expect victory, but because they no longer fear continuation, knowing that decay is not an ending but a state of being that can be maintained forever. Imperial Tactica speaks of containing outbreaks, of purging tainted systems, of firestorms that leave nothing alive, yet such victories feel increasingly hollow, for every burned world becomes another wound in the Imperium's vast, overstretched body, another place where memory rots into legend and legend into neglect, fertile soil for the plague god's influence to return in subtler forms. There are whispers, carefully excised from sanctioned records, that even the Astronomican's steady light cannot fully banish despair, that astropaths sometimes sense a pressure behind their thoughts, not a voice but a presence, warm and patient, waiting for them to tire of screaming into the void. No imperial scholar would dare to write that Nurgle is winning, because that implies a contest with rules and an ending. Yet some confess in private that he may not need to win at all, because the galaxy itself has become a mechanism of endless attrition, perfectly suited to his nature. On plague worlds abandoned by both Imperium and Chaos alike, life continues in grotesque harmony. Fungal forests breathing out sweet, nauseating air, communities of the infected tending their dead with care rather than horror, singing hymns not of conquest but of gratitude for another dawn. And while inquisitors brand these places abominations, their reports sometimes betray a flicker of confusion, even envy, at the strange stability found there. In the Indomitus era, as Primarchs return and Crusade banners rise once more, Nurgle's response is not fury, but quiet satisfaction. For every new war brings fresh refugees, fresh shortages, fresh grief, and fresh reasons for mortals to seek meaning in suffering rather than escape from it. Demons speak, when they speak at all, of their god tending his garden with unbroken attention, pruning and nurturing alike, unconcerned with the boasts of corn or the schemes of Tzeentch, because time itself bends gently in his favor, stretching moments of pain into eternities of endurance. Even the Imperium's most faithful servants sometimes betray this truth in their language, speaking of holding the line no matter the cost, of sacrifices that must be made, of lives spent like fuel in a manufactorum furnace. And in those phrases, Nurgle's philosophy echoes back, stripped of its demon masks and made almost respectable. There are heretical rumors passed between plague surgeons and renegade scholars that Nurgle does not dream of a galaxy drowned entirely in filth, but of one locked forever in a cycle of injury and recovery, war and ceasefire, hope and disappointment, a living system that can never truly heal and therefore never truly die. If such thoughts ever brush the minds of the faithful on Terra, they are smothered beneath prayer and duty. Yet the fact remains that the Imperium endures not because it is healthy, but because it is stubborn, and stubbornness is a close cousin to resignation. In that sense, Nurgle's future is already written into the present, etched into every rusting bulkhead, every overworked servitor, every soldier who fights not for victory, but because stopping feels impossible. The galaxy spins on, vast and wounded, and somewhere beyond the veil of real space, a god smiles not with triumph, but with contentment, knowing that as long as life fears the finality of death more than the weight of living, his dominion will never need to expand, because it is already everywhere, breathing softly, promising that nothing truly ends, and that even in ruin, there is a place to rest.